I know this one. Mootlings are small, easy to forget, simple to suppress, and crush under the boot. You need the Emperor close, so you can remind him you're here. Ha! Do you think Boris Todbringer will give a goblin's chuff about you? Ha 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 ha! Warhammer is, to the surprise of no one, a game all about war. One of the more unique parts of the setting is that every faction in the game has at least one good reason for fighting every other faction in the game, including, of course, themselves. When I was in my high school wargames club, I used to play an Empire army, and I was the only one in the club for many years with an Empire army. Eventually, the other members of the club would joke about how every time I would face someone, it would be an iconic matchup against the Empire. What's nice about Warhammer Fantasy is that the reasons for your armies to be fighting each other can range from existential disagreements about the fundamental nature of reality to someone simply shortchanging someone a few coppers on a building project. A lot of what happens in Warhammer Fantasy comes off as justified warfare. It's hard to imagine someone really reasoning with an orc about not invading your lands when warfare is sort of biologically wired into them. It's very morally simple. A lot of the warfare in Warhammer is. But sometimes I think that means we forget that many of the conflicts in Warhammer Fantasy are purely tragic, laughable for the fact that they're fictional. So gather round and I'll tell you a tale of one such tragedy: the attempted genocide of the Halflings. First, let's start with the Halflings. Warhammer Fantasy draws from the Lord of the Rings in the same way that a writer procrastinating at a Starbucks uses their Wi-Fi. That is to say, pretty much entirely dependent on it and very quick to deny that they're on it. Warhammer Halflings are not called hobbits, but they are very similar, in at least design, to Tolkien's. They live in a rural, agricultural land called the Moot. It's quite large and full of food and merriment, but unlike the Shire, the Moot was created by taking land from the provinces of Averland and Stirland to build an enclave for the Halflings, all at the behest of the then Emperor Ludwig. The rival counts of those provinces did not like this, but the Halflings have managed to retain their pseudo-autonomy, and of course their imperial vote, for centuries. This is more an act of political maneuvering than it is military, however. The Halflings do not have much in the way of a comparable army, even to the poorest or weakest of the imperial provinces, and what forces they do have are primarily designed for their own local protection. The Halflings have a sort of precarious existence then. In theory, the armies of the Empire would have to come to their defense, if the need was great. In practice, this is not often the case, and the Halflings and the people around them often get into all sorts of scuffles about who has grazing rights to which piece of land, and so on and so forth. The positioning of the province does afford it some natural protection. Anyone who would want to attack the Moot has to first get through either Averland or Stirland. The Moot is also very far away from places like the Drakvald or, of course, the Frozen North, and it's strategically unimportant enough for most of the major powers to never have to worry about fighting over it. Even the undead to their east would probably prefer to attack a more densely populated area, for the Halflings are nimble and can disappear more easily when they need to. That means, primarily, the Halflings of the Moot have to worry about their neighbors as their primary threat. It's possible for anyone to make a determined attack against the Moot. It's just more likely that when enemies come to their doorstep, they're bearing the flags of Averland or Stirland. So with that in mind, let me set the stage. I think one of the funny things about the Halfling genocide, if you could even say that, is how reasonable all of this started. The year is 2502. Marius Leitdorf, Elector Count of Averland, and Ulrich Haupt Andersson, Elector Count of Stirland, have agreed to combine their forces against the goblin warlord Nobgarg. In Total Warhammer, it's quite easy to just move one army across the state. You just left-click and they'll move. The logistical and organizational issues are, for the most part, abstracted away. But in the reality of the Warhammer lore, moving two huge armies, especially in pre-industrial times, is a huge undertaking. So to solve this problem of how to move one army from Stirland and Averland, vice versa, Marius Leitdorf approached the Halfling elders, who are the political leaders of the Moot, and asked them for permission to build roads through their territory. Importantly, Marius wanted a river built over the River Ster. River crossings are notoriously difficult to deal with, and a modern stone bridge would mean that instead of relying on ferries and barges, the army could simply march over the river without delay. If anyone has ever played a bridge battle in Total War, they can tell you how notoriously easy they are to destroy an utterly superior force just by virtue of the fact that they must cross the river to get to you. This, however, is where the problem would occur. As soon as the engineers began to build, they would find obstructions to their efforts. Materials would go missing, guards would be disappeared, and the construction of the bridge would be halted. The engineers of this project appealed to the Halfling elders as, according to them, the Halflings were behind the construction delays. In particular, the Tomfiddle family, who operated the ferry across the River Ster. If a bridge were to be built, it would drive them out of business, so they had every incentive to halt the bridge project. According to the Halfling elders, permission had been given only for roads, not bridges, thus nothing could be done. Naturally, this does not end well. Marius Leitdorf, not known to be the most level-headed of the elector counts, was driven into an absolute rage. He had paid a lot of gold and animals to bribe the elders to accept his proposal for the infrastructure project. Now, the project was falling behind because of the seemingly minor technicalities. After all, what is a bridge if not a road that simply goes over water? Unfortunately for the Halflings, his response to the situation would be to mobilize the Averland army and invade the Moot. As mentioned, the Halflings are not necessarily a warlike people. The first battle of this campaign is therefore the Battle of Nearstream, and it was basically a one-sided slaughter. Averland is a rich and powerful province with a well-trained army. Don't let Marius Leitdorf's madness fool you. The Halflings panicked almost immediately at the sight of the force arrayed against them and fled, with the Averlanders cutting them down in course. This, of course, produces a panic in the Moot, who force the elders into hiding, and of course everybody is desperate to try and get some help. Marius, for his part, continues to spiral into madness, trying to exterminate all of the Halflings that he can find. It was so bad that most of the Imperial army, about 3/4 of it or so, deserted him, electing to go back to Averland rather than to participate in what is increasingly becoming a genocidal campaign against the Halflings. However, the Halflings were not entirely alone. Some letters for aid had reached Altdorf, and an imperial army under the command of Ludwig Schwarzhelm was mustered to halt the Mad Count's worst excesses. Furthermore, Lumpkin Krupp, a famous Halfling mercenary, had gathered his company to fight alongside a mercenary ogre tyrant who also came to the Halflings' aid, although probably for much more personal and selfish reasons than purely trying to aid some people in need. So this battle between the Halflings and Ogres and Averland army can actually be fought with rules from White Dwarf 314, although an official outcome was never given. Given that Marius Leitdorf lives to have his own excesses reined in by Schwarzhelm, I'd say that Marius managed to win this fight. That Marius's attempted Halfling genocide is actually called the Halfling Rebellion probably speaks to the success that he had in rebranding the disastrous affair into something else. The official story indicates that Marius was able to spin his invasion of the Moot as an attempt to lure the ogres into an ambush where they could be defeated. This story, as implausible as it sounds, was then used to recast the entire affair into a victory for Leitdorf, and of course a rebellion for the Halflings. He doesn't escape entirely, however. Schwarzhelm was sent to curb Marius's behavior, and since Marius kept his head and avoided the sword of justice, he probably would have had to have moderated his behavior. I think this whole affair is a good reminder of the potential for Warhammer Fantasy to tell stories that are very morally complicated. Marius Leitdorf definitely would have killed every Halfling he came across. I think that if nobody had stopped him in his madness, he probably would have actually done a real genocide against the Halflings. In his defense, to play devil's advocate for a second, he did first resort to diplomacy. Only once the Halflings started obstructing the bridge did he really become deranged. He has been known to be completely unhinged, and even his in-game rules reflect his madness, so his ability to make completely conscious decisions, that's kind of up in the air. Of course, putting such a person in charge of something as large as an imperial province, that's also another question for another day. However, against Marius, his actions were almost universally condemned, both in terms of his army deserting him and, of course, an imperial army coming to stop him. That demonstrates to me, at least, that Leitdorf was playing a very dangerous game. Ironically, if the Halflings hadn't been so overeager to call for aid, and sent letters to everyone, then the Imperial army would have shown up and Marius probably would have faced more serious repercussions for his actions. I fully believe that Schwarzsam would have taken Marius' head, if not for the fact that a more politically convenient explanation appeared with the army of the ogres. Therefore, it was easier to save face by claiming that Marius had done all of this, caused all of this suffering, simply to defeat an ogre warlord, than that Marius had attempted to genocide a whole people inside of the empire. This, of course, is coming at a lot of halfling lives. Warhammer Fantasy, despite being a setting with a lot of morally grey factions, generally has simple black and white conflicts. This one, however, is not quite so simple. All of this started with noble intentions. Building infrastructure to fight a goblin warlord would only be to the benefit of the empire, of everyone in the empire, of men, of halflings, of the Moot, of Averland and Steerland. No one had intended to genocide the halflings, but the fact that things almost went that far is an indication of how competing interests and lingering resentments can boil into outright and hostile warfare. Dirty, ugly, hostile warfare. If nothing else, it's a reminder that you always read the fine print on your contracts. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember to give the video a like, share it if you would be so kind, and to subscribe to the channel. Thank you and take care.